The wind over the Nebraska panhandle did not blow. It hunted. It found every seam in a man's coat and every crack in a child's small heart. In the late autumn of 1889, that wind chased Boone Calloway down the frozen wagon road toward a ranch he had never seen. His son Toby rode against his chest in a canvas sling, 4 years old and shaking, his small hands curled into fists inside his father's collar. His daughter Rose, 7, walked beside him with her chin tucked into her scarf, counting her own footsteps to keep from crying. Boone had $1 in his pocket and a promise he had made to a dying woman 2 winters ago. He did not yet know that before the first snow buried the county road, the wealthiest widow in the territory would stand on her own porch and ask him a question no stranger had ever asked him before. The sun sank low and orange behind the bluffs, and somewhere ahead, a lamp burned in a window like a small, stubborn star. Boone Calloway had once owned 300 acres of good Nebraska wheat land. He had lost it the way most men lost everything out here, slowly and then all at once. 2 years of drought had cracked the soil into a map of dead rivers. The bank in Ogallala had taken the deed on a cold Tuesday morning while his children watched from the wagon seat. His wife Ellen had died the winter before that, fever taking her in 4 days flat, and Boone had buried her beneath a cottonwood tree with his own 2 hands because he could not afford to pay another man to dig. He was 31 years old and looked 40, his shoulders permanently bent from carrying more than one man's share of grief. 12 miles east, in a fine clapboard ranch house that overlooked the widest, greenest stretch of grass in 3 counties, Margaret Ashford stood at her kitchen window and watched the same darkening sky. She was 39, and she owned more land than any man in the territory dared to admit out loud. Her husband Daniel had built the Ashford Ranch from nothing before a rockslide in the Wildcat Hills took him from her 4 years ago. She wore a light blue dress that morning, the color of a sky she rarely looked at anymore, and her hands were steady, capable hands that had signed deeds and buried a husband and never once in 4 years learned to stop reaching for a second coffee cup out of habit before remembering there was no one left to pour it for. The wagon road ended at Margaret's gate just as the last light drained out of the sky. Boone stopped there, his boots sinking into the frozen mud, and looked up at the biggest house he had seen in a year of walking. He tipped his hat, though his hand shook so badly the brim nearly slipped from his fingers. "Evening, ma'am," he said, his voice worn thin as old rope. "I'm not looking for charity. I'm looking for work, and failing that, I'm looking for a corner of your barn where my children won't freeze tonight." Margaret studied him from the porch, the way a rancher studies weather before deciding whether to bring the herd in. She saw the girl's chapped lips and the boy's 2 still eyes, the particular stillness of a child who has learned that crying does not fix cold. "A barn," she repeated, not quite a question. "That's all you're asking for, mister." Boone's jaw tightened with the last of his pride. "I can mend fence. I can break horses. I've built a barn with my own hands before, ma'am, and I can build one again if that's what's owed. I don't need much. Just shelter till the worst of the cold passes, and honest work to pay for it." He looked down at his son, and something in his face cracked open just slightly, enough for Margaret to see straight through to the man underneath the exhaustion. "I would not ask for myself. I've slept colder nights than this and lived, but I can't ask my children to do the same." Margaret came down the porch steps slowly, her breath fogging in the cold air. She did not offer her hand. She looked at Rose, then at Toby, then finally back at Boone, and something in her chest that had been locked shut for 4 years gave a single painful turn, like a hinge that had rusted from disuse. "I don't have work for a stranger," she said, and her voice was firm, the voice of a woman who had learned the hard way what happens when you let softness show on a frontier full of men who mistake it for weakness. "This land has taught me that kindness costs more than it looks like it costs. I buried a husband because he trusted the wrong men. I won't make that mistake twice." Boone's shoulders dropped, not in surprise, but in the tired acceptance of a man who had heard some version of that sentence in 6 towns already. "I understand, ma'am," he said quietly. "We'll be moving on then. Thank you for hearing me out." He turned Rose gently by the shoulder and took one step back toward the darkening road. And it was that single step, that quiet dignity in the face of another closed door, that made Margaret Ashford open her mouth before she decided to speak at all. "Wait," she said, and the word cut through the wind like a rifle shot. Boone stopped. He did not turn around right away, as though he was afraid that turning would make the word disappear. When he finally faced her, Margaret's arms were no longer crossed over her chest. They hung loose at her sides, and her chin was lifted the way it lifted when she was about to say something that frightened her more than any storm ever had. "I don't need a barn hand," she said. "I need a husband, Mr. Calloway. This ranch is too large for one woman to hold alone, and men in this territory have started circling it the way wolves circle a wounded animal, waiting for me to slip. If you'll marry me, on paper, in name, a partnership and nothing more, I'll give your children a warm bed tonight and every night after. You'll have a roof, wages, and half a claim to protect. I'll have a name on the deed that the land office and the wolves alike will respect." Boone stared at her as though she had spoken in a language he didn't know. His hat, halfway lifted to tip in farewell, froze in midair. What happened next left him in shock, and for one long, wind-torn moment, neither of them said another word. "Marry you," Boone repeated, and the words came out rough, disbelieving. "You don't know me, ma'am. You don't know if I'm an honest man or a liar who'll rob you blind the moment your back is turned." Margaret held his gaze without flinching. "I know you walked 12 miles in this wind with a child on your chest and asked for a barn instead of a bed," she said. "I know you tipped your hat to a stranger before you asked her for anything at all. I've learned to read men quickly out here, Mr. Calloway. It's how I've survived." Still, Boone hesitated. Pride is a stubborn thing, and his had been beaten down so many times in the last 2 years that it had grown sharp edges, defensive ones. "I don't take charity," he said, echoing the same refusal he had given in every town before this one. "And a marriage born of desperation isn't a marriage, ma'am. It's a debt with a ring on it." Margaret's eyes flickered, something old and wounded passing behind them before she buried it again. "Then don't think of it as charity," she said. "Think of it as two people surviving the only way this land allows. I lost my husband to men who wanted this ranch more than they wanted honesty. I lost the chance to ever have children of my own in the years since, watching this house stay empty while I grew older inside it. I'm not offering you love, Mr. Calloway. I'm offering you a fighting chance, and I'm asking for the same in return." Boone looked down at Toby's small, trusting face pressed against his collar, and then at Rose, whose eyes had gone wide and hopeful in a way that broke something open in his chest faster than any argument could have. A father who has watched his children go hungry learns quickly which kinds of pride are worth keeping and which kinds must be set down like a heavy pack at the end of a long road. "For them," he said finally, his voice barely above the wind. "I'll do it for them, ma'am, not for me." Margaret nodded once, sharp and businesslike, though her hand trembled slightly as she extended it toward him for the first time. "Then we understand each other," she said. "Come inside before that boy's lips turn any bluer. We'll ride for the circuit preacher in Kimball at first light. There's stew on the stove, and a fire that hasn't gone cold in 4 years, Mr. Calloway. Let's see if we can't put it to better use tonight." An old ranch hand named Elias Marsh, who had worked the Ashford spread since before Daniel Ashford died, watched the whole exchange from the barn doorway with his hat pushed back on his head. He said nothing that night, but he would tell Boone later over a shared cup of coffee in the frozen dawn that he had never in 30 years seen Margaret Ashford's hands shake the way they'd shaken when she said the word husband. The house that swallowed Boone and his children that night smelled of cedar and wood smoke, and something else, something Toby would later say smelled like safe. There was a feather bed in the spare room, and Rose sank into it as though she had forgotten such things existed. There was stew thick with beef and potatoes, more meat than the children had eaten in a single sitting and longer than Boone cared to remember. He watched his son eat without fear for the first time in months, watched Rose's shoulders finally drop from around her ears, and something in his chest loosened so suddenly it nearly buckled his knees. Margaret excused herself early that night, saying she needed to see to the morning's arrangements, but Boone heard through the thin wall separating the kitchen from her room the unmistakable sound of quiet crying, the kind a person only allows themselves when they believe no one else can hear. He did not knock. He understood, better than most men could, that some grief needs privacy the way a wound needs air. They rode for Kimball at dawn, the frost still thick on the grass, and the ceremony itself lasted less than 10 minutes. There were no flowers. There was no music. The circuit preacher, a tired man named Reverend Coyle, read the words in a flat, practiced voice, and Boone said, "I do," in a rasp that sounded like it belonged to someone twice his age. Margaret's voice, when her turn came, was steadier than his, though her hand trembled just enough for Boone to feel it against his own. Outside the small church, a knot of townsfolk had already gathered, drawn by whispers that traveled faster than any telegraph line. A man in a fine gray suit stood at the edge of the crowd, watching with the cold, calculating patience of a hawk. His name was Harlan Pryor, and he represented the Union Pacific Land Syndicate, which had been circling the Ashford water rights for 2 years, waiting for Margaret to weaken. "Congratulations, Mrs. Calloway," he called out, his smile thin as a knife's edge. "Didn't know you were in the market for a husband. Or is it a hired hand you've dressed up for the occasion?" Margaret did not blink. "My husband doesn't care for wasted time, Mr. Pryor," she said, "and neither do I." Boone said nothing at all. He simply looked at Harlan Pryor with a stillness that made the smile slide right off the man's face, the stillness of someone who has already lost everything a threat could take from him. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm neither of them expected. Boone rose before dawn and worked until his hands bled, mending fence line that had sagged for 2 winters, repairing the barn roof, breaking a pair of half-wild colts that no other hand on the ranch would touch. He never once asked for more than his agreed wages, and when Margaret left a basket of fresh bread and jam at the bunkhouse door one evening, he returned half of it the next morning without a word of explanation, only a note that said the children had enough. Margaret, in turn, found herself drawn to the children in a way that frightened her more than the wolves circling her deed ever had. She taught Rose her letters using a charred stick and the smooth dirt floor of the porch. She sat up 3 nights running when Toby's cough turned worrying, pressing cool cloths to his forehead and singing him a lullaby she hadn't sung since a room down the hall had gone silent, years before Boone Calloway ever walked up her road. One evening, she found a small carved wooden horse sitting on the porch rail, no note attached, the wood still faintly warm from the whittling knife. She knew without being told exactly whose hands had made it, and she kept it in her apron pocket for 3 days before she found the courage to say thank you. The gossip in town grew sharper as the weeks passed. Women at the Kimball dry goods store spoke behind gloved hands whenever Margaret's name came up. "A widow marrying a drifter she met at her own gate," one whispered. "It don't sit right with decent folk," another added, loud enough to carry. "Those poor children, dragged along on some stranger's desperate gamble." Margaret heard every word and let it slide off her like rain off an oiled coat. But the danger sharpened when Harlan Pryor returned, this time not with insults, but with paper. He rode up to the ranch gate on a gray afternoon with 2 men in dark coats behind him and a survey document rolled beneath his arm. "There's a question of an old boundary line, Mrs. Calloway," he said, unrolling the map across his saddle horn. "My surveyors believe the north section, the section with your good spring water, was never properly recorded under your late husband's claim. If you can't produce the original filing within 30 days, the syndicate intends to file for it ourselves." Margaret's face went pale beneath her composure, because she knew better than anyone that the original filing had burned in a fire the same year Daniel died, and she had never managed to get it re-recorded through the tangle of territorial paperwork since. "That water feeds every head of cattle on this ranch," she said. "You'd starve my herd for a piece of paper." Harlan Pryor's smile did not waver. 30 days, Mrs. Calloway. The syndicate is not in the business of waiting." That night, after the children were asleep, Margaret and Boone sat by the hearth in a silence that had grown less awkward with every passing week. The fire cracked and settled, throwing long shadows across the floorboards. "I know what that land means to you," Boone said finally, his voice low. "I heard what Pryor said." Margaret stared into the flames, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee gone cold an hour ago. Daniel used to say a man builds a ranch with his hands, but he protects it with his name, she said. I have the ranch. For 4 years, I haven't been sure I still have the name to protect it. Boone was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried something rawer than she had heard from him before. I buried my wife under a tree because I couldn't afford a proper stone, he said. I told myself I'd never let my children see me broken again after that, and then I walked 12 miles and begged a stranger for a barn. Pride is a fine thing to have when you can afford it, Margaret. Out here, most of us can't. Margaret turned to look at him, really look at him, in a way she hadn't allowed herself since the day at the gate. I lost the chance to have children of my own, she said quietly, the words coming slow and hard like something being pried loose after years of rust. Daniel and I tried for 6 years. Then he was gone, and the trying was gone with him, and I told myself the house would just stay empty, that it was easier that way. Then Rose fell asleep in my lap 3 nights ago while I was reading to her, and I realized I had been lying to myself the whole time. She looked at him directly. They were 2 broken pieces of a puzzle, and for the first time in a long while, they were starting to fit. We are more than halfway through Margaret and Boone's story now, and if their quiet courage on that frontier has stirred something in you, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss the next tale from this same forgotten corner of the American West. What do you think is hiding in that old land office filing Margaret lost in the fire? Tell us in the comments what you believe Harlan Pryor will do when his 30 days run out. Now, back to Nebraska, where the sky outside had turned the color of a bruised plum and the wind had begun, once again, to scream. The blizzard came 3 days before Pryor's deadline, and it came without mercy. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in under 2 hours, and the sky that had been merely gray turned the color of iron and then vanished altogether behind a wall of driven snow. Boone was out checking the north fence line when the storm hit, and within minutes he could not see his own hand in front of his face. Margaret, inside with the children, watched the windows go white and felt her heart climb into her throat. Papa promised he wouldn't leave us, Toby said, his small hands pressed flat against the frozen glass. Margaret knelt and pulled him close. Your papa is the strongest man I have ever known, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. He will find his way back to us. We are going to believe that until he walks through that door. But she knew, with a rancher's grim certainty, exactly how many men had frozen to death within sight of their own porches in storms just like this one. She lit every lamp in the house and set them in the windows, small, stubborn fires against the howling dark, and prayed to a God she had stopped speaking to 4 years ago that he might be listening again tonight. Boone had tied a length of rope between the north fence post and the barn that very week, an old habit from his years on the Nebraska plains, never quite believing safety was guaranteed. He gripped that rope now with both hands, his fingers already going numb inside his gloves, and pulled himself hand over hand through snow that stung like needles and swallowed sound whole. Twice he lost his footing and fell to his knees. Twice he forced himself back up, thinking of Rose's laugh and Toby's small, trusting weight against his chest and Margaret's hands, steady and capable, reaching for his own across a fire that had begun, somewhere in these last weeks, to feel less like borrowed warmth and more like home. The rope went taut and then suddenly slack in his hands, torn loose somewhere ahead by the weight of drifted snow, and for one terrible moment, Boone Calloway knelt in a world of pure white with no path forward and no path back, the wind screaming his name back at him in a voice that sounded almost like Ellen's, almost like a warning from the dead. He thought of his children waiting behind a door he could no longer see, and something in him refused, absolutely refused, to let the storm win. He crawled the last stretch on his hands and knees, following the faint orange smear of lamplight through the white, until his frozen fist struck the bottom porch step and then the door itself. Margaret heard the pounding over the roar of the wind and threw the bar back with strength she did not know she still possessed. Boone fell into the kitchen in a heap of ice and frozen canvas, his eyebrows crusted white, his lips a ghastly shade of pale that made Margaret's breath catch in her throat. She dragged him fully inside and slammed the door against the storm, then knelt beside him, pulling off his frozen boots with shaking hands, rubbing warmth back into fingers that had nearly stopped answering him at all. "You fool," she said, and her voice broke on the word, tears cutting warm tracks down her cold cheeks. "You beautiful, stubborn fool. You could have died out there." Boone could only shiver, his teeth chattering too hard for words. But he reached one half-frozen hand toward her, and Margaret took it in both of hers and held on as though letting go might undo everything the storm had failed to take. They spent 2 days snowed in together, the world outside reduced to a single roaring white silence, the children curled beneath every quilt in the house while the fire never once went out. On the second night, with Toby and Rose finally asleep in the next room, Margaret sat close beside Boone by the hearth, close enough that their shoulders touched and neither of them moved away. "Why didn't you turn back?" she asked quietly. "The barn was closer. You could have waited out the worst of it there." Boone stared into the flames for a long moment before answering. "I've spent most of my life running," he said. "Running from drought, running from a bank that took my land, running from a grief I couldn't outpace no matter how far west I walked. But tonight, out there in that storm, I wasn't running from anything, Margaret. For the first time in years, I was running toward something. I was running toward you." Margaret's breath caught, and the last of her carefully built walls she had spent 4 years reinforcing brick by careful brick, finally gave way all at once. "The arrangement was for a husband on paper," she whispered, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I find I want the real thing, Boone. I want the man who crawled through a blizzard rather than let this family fall apart." Boone did not answer with words. He rose slowly, crossed the small space between them, and took her hands, pulling her gently to her feet. In the hush of that snowbound kitchen, with the storm still howling faintly beyond the walls, he kissed her. It was not a kiss of fleeting passion or youthful recklessness. It was a kiss of promise, of survival, of 2 people who had each buried someone and had somehow, against every frontier odd, found their way to standing together in the wreckage. When the storm finally broke on the 4th morning, the world outside was reshaped entirely. Drifts taller than the fence posts, the barn nearly buried to its eaves, but the barn itself still standing, still holding, because Boone had built it strong enough to survive exactly this kind of night. The cattle were hungry but alive. The children woke to sunlight blazing off an ocean of white and ran shrieking with joy into the yard, throwing snow at each other while their father and Margaret watched from the porch, her hand resting easily in his now, as though it had always belonged there. But the reprieve did not last. Word had reached Kimball that the Ashford Ranch had survived the blizzard intact, and Harlan Pryor, sensing his window closing, rode out that very week with his survey papers and 2 hired men in tow, determined to press his claim before the 30 days ran their course. He found Margaret and Boone together at the north fence line, repairing a section damaged by the storm, and he dismounted slowly, savoring what he clearly believed was a moment of triumph. "30 days are nearly up, Mrs. Calloway," he said, unrolling his map once more. "Without that original filing, this section reverts to unclaimed territory and the syndicate has already submitted paperwork to secure it." Margaret's chin lifted, the same defiant lift Boone had come to recognize as the truest part of her. "I found the filing, Mr. Pryor," she said calmly, drawing a folded water-stained paper from her coat. "It didn't burn in the fire, after all. Daniel had made a duplicate and filed it with the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne the very same year, a fact your syndicate's own surveyors would have discovered if they'd bothered to look past the county courthouse." Harlan Pryor's face drained of color as he snatched the paper and scanned it, his hired men shifting uncomfortably behind him. "This changes nothing," he said, though his voice had lost its earlier confidence. "You," he added, turning his glare toward Boone, "a man with no name of his own until a month ago, standing here like you belong on this land." Boone stepped forward, not with anger, but with the quiet, immovable stillness of a man who had already survived worse threats than this one. "I have a name, Mr. Pryor," he said. "It's Calloway now, same as my wife's and same as my children's. And this land belongs to people who bled for it, not to a company that's never once set foot on it in a storm." Pryor looked between them, at the fence line freshly mended, at the cattle grazing safe in a field that should have been buried under syndicate paperwork by now. And for the first time in 2 years of circling this ranch, he understood he had finally lost. He rolled his map without another word, mounted his horse, and rode back toward Kimball. And no one from the syndicate ever troubled the Ashford water rights again. Spring arrived slowly across the Nebraska plains that year, the way it always does after a hard winter, reluctant at first, and then all at once. The wild roses began to bud along the creek bank, and the grass turned the deep green of new beginnings. Boone and Margaret were married a second time that spring, this time before the whole town of Kimball rather than a hurried circuit preacher and an empty church. There were wildflowers gathered by Rose's own small hands, and a fiddle player from the Kimball saloon who played for free because, he said later, he had never seen two people look at each other quite the way Boone and Margaret did that afternoon. Reverend Coyle, who had married them the first time with a flat, practiced voice, smiled through the entire second ceremony, watching a family that had been forged in desperation now bound together by something far sturdier. Rose stood as flower girl in a new dress of fine blue wool, the same color as the sky Margaret had worn the day they first met at the gate. And when the ceremony ended, Toby ran to Margaret and, without prompting, without anyone teaching him the word, wrapped his small arms around her waist and called her Mama for the first time. Margaret froze completely still, one hand pressed to her heart, tears spilling freely down her face before she finally knelt and gathered him into her arms, holding him the way she had once dreamed of holding a child of her own, all those years ago, in a house that had finally, truly, stopped being empty. Years later, travelers passing through Kimball still spoke of the Ashford Ranch, though most had long since started calling it the Callaway Spread instead. They spoke of the wealthy widow who had once turned away every hired hand who came to her gate, and of the desperate father who had asked for nothing more than a corner of her barn. They no longer spoke with the mocking whispers of that first cold autumn. They spoke with genuine wonder, the way people speak of something that had, against every hard lesson the frontier ever taught, turned out right. The ranch thrived under Boone's steady hands and Margaret's sharpened business sense, and travelers who stopped there for the night were never once turned away hungry, because Margaret and Boone both remembered exactly what it felt like to stand at someone else's gate with nothing but a plea and a prayer. Above the mantel in the ranch house, beside a small carved wooden horse worn smooth from years of handling, hung Rose's very first hand-lettered sample, the alphabet she had learned by firelight in her first winter on the ranch. It started with a barn, Margaret liked to say to anyone who asked about it, and it ended with a home neither of us ever thought we'd get to have. Family isn't always about the blood that runs in a person's veins. Sometimes it's about the people who see you at your very worst, cold, broken, and asking for nothing but shelter, and choose, with everything they have, to keep you anyway. It's about the hard bargains desperate people strike to survive a Nebraska winter, and the quiet grace that can turn those bargains into something that lasts a lifetime. If Boone and Margaret's story stayed with you, tell us in the comments which moment moved you most, the barn he begged for, the blizzard he crawled through, or the boy who called her Mama for the very first time. Please like, subscribe, and share this story with someone who still believes kindness can rebuild a broken life. In our next story, a school teacher with nothing left to lose offers a grieving rancher one impossible winter bargain, and neither of them expects what it costs to keep it. This is a fictional frontier romance inspired by the real hardships of the American West. And while it touches on grief, poverty, and the brutal cold of the plains, every difficult moment has been told with care and without graphic detail, brought to life here for your entertainment. Until the next trail, keep your fire burning and your heart open to the stranger at your gate. God bless the pioneers, and God bless the hearts that refuse to break.